Annie, and I am so excited that you're joining me for this week's Neighborhood Nature. And this time around, we are talking about water. And luckily for us, it's raining today, so we're getting to take a little look at all of the rain all around us. Now, whenever I'm in nature and I look around, I always end up with a million questions. I don't know about you, but I always just want to know everything. And when I'm standing out here in the rain, all I can think of is, wow, where in the world does this water come from and where does it go? It's raining, it's gonna keep raining, and then tomorrow, all of that water, it's gone. Where did it go? I don't understand how it moves through my neighborhood. And so that's what we're gonna investigate this week. We are going to work together to try to figure out where the water goes and how it got here in the first place. And I hope you're excited to join me. Now, when it's raining like this, I love to spend some time looking into puddles and seeing what I can find. Have you ever looked into a puddle? There's all sorts of life that we can see in a puddle. One of my favorite things to look for on a rainy day is worms. Have you ever gone looking for worms? I think it's so cool and just really shows us how important rain can be to the smallest and the biggest of creatures. When it rains, the water makes the ground really wet because the rain gets into that dirt. And when that water gets super wet, it gives worms a chance to dig up to the surface and move around really easily. Now, worms are important because they help to turn the soil over and make it really rich and healthy and nutritious for our plants, right? And so we have these worms moving about in the rain, in the water, making the soil really dense and good for our plants. And then our plants, of course, grow everything that we need to have a functioning ecosystem. The plants feed the animals and the food chain goes on. And so it's really cool on a rainy day to go out and look for some of these animals that we might find, like the worms who need the rainwater to be able to move around. You might not know this, but when rain is falling from the sky, that has a special name. It's called precipitation. So when it rains or snows or hails, that is all precipitation. Water, in one form or another, is falling from the sky. So when we have precipitation, there are two things that are going to happen. One is that a lot of the water is going to hit the surface and run away. It's going to go elsewhere. But some of that water is going to soak into the ground. This is called infiltration. And infiltration is so important for everything in our neighborhoods because if the water didn't soak into the ground, how would the plants be able to drink it? As a gardener, I'm really happy that we're having rain right now and that the rainwater is going to infiltrate my raised beds and give my plants lots to drink. Now, there are a few different things that impact whether or not the water can actually get into the ground. The first thing that we can notice by looking at my raised bed is that most of it is bare dirt. Obviously, I have my plants growing, but there's not grass down over the dirt. The dirt is just bare, right? Now, this is going to help water from the sky soak in better. The water is going to be able to infiltrate further into the ground to give our plants plenty of water to drink. Other thing you'll notice is that my garden is on a flat surface. If it is sloped, it's really hard for the water to soak in. It just wants to run away. So the slope of our ground impacts how much water goes in. Also, the type of soil is going to make a big difference to whether or not the water can soak in. I put down a good soil for retaining water, for helping my plants to be able to breathe. There are other types of soil. So for instance, if you live in an area with a lot of clay, that clay is going to be really difficult for water to infiltrate in and soak into the ground. So it's more difficult for some plants to be happy in a clay soil because the rainwater isn't going to infiltrate as easier. It's easier for that water to run off and run to a different place. If you walk around your neighborhood on a rainy day, you are going to see so many happy plants. When I stand in my backyard on this rainy day, all I can see is happy plants, soaking up that water. Water is so important for everything that we are surrounded by. If we didn't have rainwater falling down on us, our plants would wither up and die. And then all of us animals that eat plants, well, what would happen to us? It would not be very good. So when it rains, we can be very grateful that we are getting both food from the plants and water from the rain.
We just learned all about precipitation and infiltration. Let's leave my backyard now and check out the next step in the water cycle and what happens to all of that water that doesn't end up soaking into the ground through infiltration.
So welcome to the duck pond in my neighborhood. Here at the duck pond, we can see a bunch of water all collected together. And we're going to talk about the process by which this water leaves this pond and goes up into the atmosphere. That is called evaporation. Did you know that 90% of the water that falls down as rain is evaporated up off of our bodies of water? So lakes, ponds, streams, creeks, rivers, and the ocean provide most of the water power, if you will, for our rain. It's mostly coming from the evaporation of the water from these pools or these running areas back up into the sky. But how does this work? What is happening when water is evaporating? So when water evaporates, if we could look at our water, we would see that the water molecules are getting really hot. They're getting warmer and they're starting to move more quickly. And so they are going to basically change from liquid water to water vapor. And then they're going to go up into the atmosphere and they are going to form clouds. And this is the process of evaporation.
Speaking of clouds, we've arrived at the final step of the water cycle. We talked about precipitation, bringing the water drops down, evaporation, bringing them back up into the sky. So finally, we have condensation. And this is where those water droplets that are now vapor are going to turn back into actual water in the form of the cloud. So this is condensation. Over time, they're all going to condense together and they're going to get so heavy that they're going to fall back down to the earth as rain, as our precipitation, and the cycle starts all over.
There are a lot of different neighborhoods that have bodies of water like this in them. There are a lot of good uses for a pond like this. The reason that this pond is here is to help retain some of the water. If this pond weren't here, we would have water kind of running off everywhere, flooding different areas. By creating a pond, this was created for this neighborhood, we're giving some of this water a place to go, so it's not just flooding in different areas. It's able to run together into this one body of water. And, you know, I called this a duck pond when I came out, first of all, because we have a lot of different wildlife living around this body of water. We regularly see ducks and geese. I just heard a frog a moment ago. There are bugs everywhere, all congregating around this body of water. So this pond inside my neighborhood is providing a lot of life that you wouldn't see if this water were not here. One thing you might notice if you have a body of water near your neighborhood is that the level of the water changes. If it is rained a lot, if there's a lot of precipitation, you will notice that your pond, creek, whatever it may be, might be really high. The water is much higher than you're used to seeing it. And then sometimes, especially like in the heat of the summer, if we aren't having a lot of precipitation, the water level gets really low. You might notice it starts to smell pretty bad. This is water evaporating faster than it's coming back in. So more water is going into the atmosphere than it is coming back into the ground and into our body of water. So by looking at the height of our water sources around us, we can make a determination of what the overall water situation is looking like in our area at that time.
You can see that if the water level starts to get very high at our pond here, We actually have a drain that's going to help us move some of this water away so that we don't overflow our ponds. And it turns out that storm drains are really important in our neighborhoods.
Storm drains are another way that water moves throughout our neighborhoods. So if you notice, I'm standing in the storm drain, the walls come down, we've got all sorts of little pipes along the storm drain that bring the water down. And this way we don't get flooding. There's a lot of precipitation falling down. It's not all going to sink into the ground, right? A lot of it is going to move, it's going to run, it has to go somewhere. So it follows the natural slope down into this big storm drain. And you notice that I'm standing in it almost looks like a fake creek. Well, this water is going to funnel to our overall water source for our neighborhood so that it is able to move throughout the neighborhood, and it doesn't just stay here flooding the area, it actually is going to move to a different source.
So welcome to the Hickman Creek. This is the creek that runs near my neighborhood, and this is where all the water is flowing to when it goes down that storm drain. It all ends up here in this creek. So we see all this water collected together and we think, wow, how many neighborhoods are connected to this creek? This creek goes for quite a while. We can walk maybe even an hour or more along this creek without ever reaching the end. So it's connected to a lot of different surrounding areas. There's a word that describes this connection, and that word is watershed. So a watershed is an area of land that's all connected together by one water source. So for me right now, I'm in the Hickman watershed because all of this area is connected to the Hickman Creek. Now you might be wondering, how do you decide what's connected to the creek and what isn't, right? If we're looking at a map and we see this creek running through, how do we decide which land gets added to that watershed? And this is a great answer because for me, I struggle a little bit with geography. I struggle a little bit with social studies. But when we're talking about watersheds, instead of just picking out lines on a map, we are actually looking at how the water moves. So we're listening to nature instead of listening to, the lines drawn on a map. So a watershed is when the rain falls from the sky in precipitation, like we talked about earlier, and when it starts to run off, wherever that water ends up, that is the watershed. So all of the land that's connected to this creek, when the water from the precipitation falls on that land, eventually the water that ran off ended up in this creek. And that is how we decide that we are together in this watershed. Water from many different neighborhoods ends up in the Hickman Creek. So we need to talk about how that impacts all of us living a sustainable life together and our water, right? We already talked about how water is so important for our smallest creatures, our worms that we talked about in the beginning, right? That's so important for them. And they're just one example. Water is really important for everything all around us. So you might think to yourself, how does what I do affect my community and affect my environment? Let's take, for instance, the idea of some paint. Let's say you recently painted your house and you spilled some paint on your front driveway. And then the rain comes down and the rain washes the paint off of your driveway down into that storm drain, and it ends up here in this creek. So now all of a sudden, the water source for all of the people connected to this watershed has a problem. It has some contamination from that paint in one person's neighborhood. So if we stop and think, how many people live in my neighborhood? And then you think, how many neighborhoods are all connected together in one watershed? You realize, wow, we are all really connected by our water source. So it's very important that we all do our best to keep it healthy. There are a lot of ways we can keep our watershed healthy, and so some of the biggest ways are to make sure that we are not littering or polluting. So that means When you're done with a candy bar, don't throw that candy wrapper on the ground, because when it rains, remember the precipitation falls down, the water runs off into a storm drain that ends up here. Now we have that candy bar wrapper in our creek. That's gonna hurt fish, it's gonna hurt the animals, it's gonna hurt the overall quality of the water, which we all need to be healthy. So, by not littering, we're keeping the watershed clean. We're also going to make sure that if we have any chemicals, maybe if, like my paint example, if you painted your house, you know, we don't want that paint to end up outside because eventually it ends up in the water. If you were cleaning, let's say your carpet, don't take that gross, like, carpet shampoo water and dump it, you know, down your storm drain because it's gonna end up here. All of the things that we are getting rid of, they have to go somewhere. And that somewhere, most of the time, is our water. So by making sure that we dispose of chemicals properly, we dispose of trash properly, these are really good ways to keep our watershed healthy.
Thank you so much for joining me today when we learned all about rain, why it's important, and where it goes in our neighborhoods. So to recap, rain falls from the sky as precipitation and hits the ground. Some of that rain will infiltrate the soil and help our plants to grow. Most of the rain, though, is going to run off the surface and end up in a pool of water. In our neighborhoods, we have storm drains to collect the running water to take to our main watershed. And a watershed is a body of water that joins a lot of different area all together because they all share the water. So it's really important for us as citizens of this planet to help keep our environment clean because all of our water is connected and anything that ends up in our area is going to wash into our waterway, into our watershed, and it's going to impact everybody that lives in that watershed. Once our water ends up in the watershed, it is going to evaporate. When the sun hits it, heats up that water, some of that water will turn back into vapor, into a gas, and go back up to the sky where it will turn into a cloud. And eventually, once it cools down, it falls back down to the ground again as precipitation. So we see precipitation, evaporation, and then condensation in that cloud, and then precipitation again. So I hope you learned a little something about the water cycle. I hope you've gotten curious about how water moves in your neighborhood. And I can't wait to hear about all your wonderful water adventures this week.